Just wanted to thanks for remembering, Kimmy, to record this.
That's Mitch. That is all Mitch.
Thank you, Mitch, for being in the background. Wanted to thank everyone for joining us to hear more about the Homeless Housing Response and Community Strengthening NOFA. This is the first NOFA like this that we have done, and so feel free to ask all the questions that you want. You can put them in the chat. You can unmute and just interrupt as we go through the slides, whatever your preference. My name is Andrea Mathiasen. I manage the Home Housing Trust Fund and now Home ARP resources for OHCS. Kimmy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Kimie Weoka. I manage the capacity building funds that are sourced from the GHAP account, the general housing account. I think I'm a program analyst in capacity building.
All right. We have an exciting agenda for today. Next slide, Mitch, please. We're just going to kind of try to get through this in an hour or less. And so we'll go through this as quickly as we can, but as thoroughly as we can. Also, we're going to talk about the available funding, the dates of the NOFA, kind of do an overview of the application process, talk a little bit about the evaluation and scoring elements, and then the development dollars and the capacity building resources have some separate programmatic resources we wanted to touch on, and then open it up to questions at the end if they have not already been asked in the chat or by coming off mute. So let's see. Back in 2021, as part of the American Rescue Plan, HUD allocated through the regular home program a new funding source called Home ARP. And so after going through an allocation process, OHCS has allocated through this NOFA $25 million in HUD Home ARP development dollars, $3 million in Home ARP capacity building and operating support that is only available to nonprofit organizations, and then $2 million in GHAP capacity building resources, which Kimie will get into more detail on later on in the webinar. Next slide. So the resources at this point have been split up into 4 geographic areas, and the map kind of gives an indication of they are the Western rural communities, the central rural communities, and then the eastern rural communities, and then an urban balance of state. The urban balance of state are the 4 green dots on the map. And those, thank you, Mitch, for highlighting those. And then the red areas in this map are areas that these reflect other home PJs that already get their own individual allocation of Home ARP. And so the OHCS Home ARP resources are balance of state Home ARP dollars. So Multnomah, Washington, Clackamas, and Marion counties, and then the cities of Salem and Eugene, Springfield are not eligible for these resources in this development resources in this NOFA because they have their own Home ARP dollars. And so you can see the percentages here that have been allocated to these different geographies. And if there's any questions about how those are split up, welcome to take those at any point. Next slide. Yes, and all of these, this map and these percentages are in the NOFA as well. The NOFA was issued on Monday, July 24th. The pre-apps are due next Friday, August 11th. And then we anticipate that the Procorum work centers should be set up and sent back to you by Tuesday, August 15th. And then the full applications will be due on Friday, October 13th at 4 p.m. We're hoping to get to Housing Stability Council with formal award announcements in December. That might be kind of an idealistic, aggressive timeline, but we're going to do our best at this point. Next slide. So in terms of eligible applicants, nonprofit organizations, tribes, public housing authorities, local governments, and then for the home ARP resources, the development resources, it is also for-profit developers can apply for those for projects. Next slide. Questions can be emailed to the email address here on this slide. Please include 2023 Home ARP NOFA on the subject line. We will publish FAQs probably weekly, depending on how questions are coming in. And then the last day to submit any questions would be Friday, September 29th. I am assuming people are here because they saw the NOFA TA announced, but if you don't, or if you are not already signed up for those, any revisions, any redlined changes to the NOFA would be email or alerted out that way. And so just wanted to remind or encourage people to sign up for those TAs if you have not already. Next slide. So in terms of an overview of the application process, as many of you may be familiar, there's a pre-application process that is very brief. It's kind of high-level preliminary information. It gives OHCS a sense of who the applicants are, and as part of that, you're required to submit the site review checklist. And it's important to know that if you do not submit the pre-application, then you cannot submit a full application. You will not be provided the Procorum Work Center, which is essentially the portal for the NOFA submission. So it's really important that the pre-application is submitted. It's critical. If it doesn't happen, then you're not able to submit a full application. And this link here, if you're not familiar with Procorum, it provides a little video for what Procorum looks like and how it works. Next slide. So the pre-application can be found on the OHCS website, along with the site review checklist. Again, as I said, those are due next Friday, August 11th. Again, critical, the pre-app is submitted. Next slide. So the site review checklists that are submitted with the pre-app on the OHCS website are submitted in a self-certified fashion. It's important to know that the project that gets submitted in the pre-app is the only project then that can be submitted in the final NOFA application. So you can't swap those out. You can submit as many pre-applications as you want and then decide not to proceed with any of those to a full application. There's no penalty. There's no charge for submitting a pre-application. And so it's fine to submit a pre-app and then not a full application. Next slide. So the Procorum work centers will be created and emailed back to folks by August 15th so that you have access through them to the full application. So in the Procorum Work Center, all of the supplemental forms and other documents are preloaded there so that you can access them. Any other evidence that you're required to submit is indicated there. And then the Work Center in Procorum follows the project through the development process for the project. It's the portal that you would submit due diligence to your production analyst or any of the compliance requirements for an environmental review or any other cross-cutting regulation requirement. So it's important that you understand how Procorum works. If you have questions about it or challenges using it, you should reach out to myself or Kimye, and we will connect you with the staff person who can help you if we cannot ourselves. Next slide. And this is for folks who have not seen Procorum. This is what a work center looks like. And so People are added to it in the right-hand column: program staff, production analysts, anyone from the development team or your organization would be added to this. And then all of the required documents are uploaded into folders. And then you would download those, you would submit completed final versions, and then you would populate the relevant appropriate folder with whatever documentation is required. Next slide. I just wanted to pause for 2 seconds and see if there are any questions. It looks like Gabe had a question about whether these funds were available in recent years. Home ARP development resources have not been available previously. Kimye has had different versions of capacity building resources available. And do we anticipate a large response to this NOFA? Given that it's the first time that we have released these resources and structured a NOFA that emphasizes an increase in capacity building in rural communities for small projects for a very vulnerable population, I think it's really challenging to kind of read the tea leaves to anticipate the kind of demand or interest in the NOFA. So yeah.
And I can add a little, at least related to the GHAP capacity building funds. Your organization can be holding another capacity building grant for a separate offering that was funded, in the last few years, and that will not reduce your eligibility or impact your eligibility for this these GHAP capacity building funds offered through this NOFA. Oh, and just to get on the record, because I don't think the chat comes over in the recording, the site review checklist is a requirement only for the home ARP development funds, not for the GHAP capacity building funds.
Thanks, Kimye. Okay, so in terms of the application review and scoring process, project applications need to pass the administrative review, which is essentially, is it complete? Is it on time? Were the charges submitted? Threshold requirements include things like, was the MWESB and all of those kinds of, and I think they're detailed later in the webinar, but threshold requirements, and then there are the scoring elements in terms of ranking the projects and prioritizing those. Next slide. In terms of home ARP development program requirements, this is kind of where we get into the nitty-gritty of the projects and eligible activities, who they can serve, what the rents and the incomes are, and some of the federal cross-cutting regulations that go along with the home ARP development resources. Next slide. So, as I said, kind of at the beginning, this is a new resource program that HUD has decided to make relatively technical. So qualifying populations and then low income populations are both eligible. A qualifying population are ones that are highlighted here at the top of this slide. Homeless, it's using the McKinney-Vento definition. At risk of homelessness, also the McKinney-Vento definition. Fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. Other populations where providing supportive services would prevent homelessness. And then veterans and families that include a veteran family member that meet one of the preceding criteria. So this is what HUD has started calling a QP, and a minimum of 70% of all of the units have to be a QP household. And one of the things about this that's different and potentially a little confusing, so I wanted to highlight it, is that you don't have to income qualify a QP individual or household. They don't have to be income qualified to be eligible. So that's 70% of all the units. Up to 30% and no more than 30% can be low income with an income of no more than 30% MFI. So I just wanted to see if there were any questions there, because we're going to come back to that in a bit. There's some scoring elements tied to this. No?
I have a question.
Mhm.
The qualifying populations, later it says that it's 50% of AMI. Is it up to 50%?
There's a reference to 50% AMI in the rent.
Yeah, so do they have to be set? Do those units have to be set at 50% of AMI? Seems like there's a disconnect between the population and the.
Yeah, so let's get
Or-
to that in a second. So this is just the income of who can occupy a unit. Because these first 5 bullets don't have to be income qualified to qualify, right? You would then do an income calculation to determine the rent, but they are not income qualified just to make them eligible to live in the units. For the
So they
QP.
could be voucher
What's that?
tenants. They could be voucher tenants.
Oh, absolutely. And that's reflected in some of the rent slides in a minute.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, next slide.
Oh, Andrea, there was also a question of, there are 2 questions in the chat. One is asking you to explain the last bullet. I'm not sure if that question was addressed by the most recent conversation with Sarah, I believe. And then there's a question from Lisa asking, do the projects that get selected have a preference for the capacity building funds?
They do not at this point.
Can I ask another question though, on the slide that you have currently up?
Mhm.
So if you have in that 70% qualifying populations that are also below 30%, does
Mhm.
that mean that 30% of the units could be rented to whoever?
Yes. Well, 30% of the units, the framing that HUD has put on this is that they are either homeless or at risk of homelessness, or they are less than 30% MFI.
So they can't be both homeless, at risk of homeless, and below 30%.
Sure, they can be.
If they are, but it doesn't, I'm just trying to think, because in the 70%,
Mhm.
if you get in that 70 all below 30%, is the last 30% of the units, can they have anybody of any income without
No,
having one of these qualifying things?
no, if you are not a member of those qualifying populations, you have to be under 30%. If all of your qualifying populations are under 30%, you still have to occupy the rest of the units with households under 30%. So the only thing I think that HUD is really trying to accomplish here is that if you're a member of a QP, you don't have to income qualify them to house them.
Yeah. Okay.
You would have to income qualify them to determine their contribution to rent, but not so that they can live there.
Okay, thank you.
It's not super simple at face value. Yeah. Next slide.
Hello.
Was there another question?
Yeah, do you have a matrix that could help us follow that?
I don't at this point, but I think one could probably be created. Yeah, we'll work on that. So HUD is only requiring 15 years of affordability, and I think I just wanted to call that out because it's likely that people would come across that piece of information as maybe you're looking at the regulations or watching HUD trainings on this funding source, but OHCS is requiring a 20-year affordability period, and the NOFA will allocate additional scoring points for 30 years of affordability. Next slide. Okay, this is where it gets fun. So the qualifying population, so it's not who can live there, it is that their rents are, their HUD is using low home rents. So again, HUD took the old regular home program and made it, they did a little spin-off. And so here's, kind of where we see the rub in some of that. So for a qualifying population, household or individual, their rent cannot exceed, and this is the definition of low home rents, 30% of the adjusted income of a household whose annual income is up to 50%. And HUD actually determines that threshold, both for low home rents and high home rents. So the max rent for a low income population, which is again, those 30% of those units, they are using the high home rent, which is 30% of adjusted income for a household whose income is up to 65% MFI. I know that this is not super clear, and I think I took this language directly from the home TA, and the NOFA has the link to the home TA with this language. So for all tenants, if the project or an individual unit has either project-based rent assistance or an individual tenant-based voucher, then the maximum rent that's allowable for the unit is the rent assistance program rent, with the tenant paying no more than the allowed contribution that's specified above for the qualifying population or low income population. I think there's some questions here. Lisa.
So because I thought you said the low income populations were below 30, but is it now 30% of 60%? So it's an effective like 20%?
So HUD differentiates between the income of someone who can live in a unit and the rent that they can be charged. And that's what's happening here. And I want to just call out a reminder that a qualifying population, individual or household, does not have to be income qualified to be eligible to live in a unit. So that's if they're eligible to live in the unit, and then the rent that they can be charged is separate. It's a separate calculation.
Okay, and so that's only for units that don't have some kind of subsidy that goes with the unit. You're talking about rents that can be charged for the unit itself that is going to be charged to the person in it, right? And that's where this 30% of 50% or 30% of 65.
Yes, correct.
But if you have some project based or somebody comes in with a voucher, then you can charge whatever it is here,
Right.
the allowable rent, and then and just collect the difference from the tenant.
Correct, but the max that you can collect from the tenant is prescribed and limited by HUD.
Which is the 50% or the 60.
Right, the 30 of the 50 and the 30 of the 65, correct. All right, I have a feeling that there will be some questions about this coming into the MF NOFA email. Next slide. Because these are federal funds, there are some cross-cutting regulations. Environmental review, there is no choice limiting action once the pre-application is submitted. So that means no changes to the dirt, no contracts that are signed that are for anything, no construction contracts, no permits pulled, things of that nature. And then if you have a project that has any tenants in it, the URA will apply, and the lead safe housing rule if that existing structure has been built before 1978 and there's proposed rehab. Next slide. There are a few program manuals that you'll just want to note exist. The OHCS General Policy Guidance Manual, the GPGM, the Home Program Manual, and then our CDM Core Development Manual, which talks about planning, design, requirements, things of that nature. Next slide. So in terms of the Home ARP development full application, once your pre-app has been submitted and you've got access to your work center, for those who have not experienced this previously, it is an Excel spreadsheet. Many of the fields will auto-populate and provide some auto kind of self-scoring information to you. We'd encourage you to kind of orient yourself to the application, reading the initial instructions tab. please don't attempt to modify or change the cells or formulas. It can make the application not function as it's intended to. And if you have submitted a NOFA application previously, just know that that application is not one that you can then kind of recycle for this NOFA. You'll need to get your hands on the new NOFA application. An example of a previous full application is on the OHCS funding page. And then when you submit an application, you're agreeing through your electronic signature to all terms and conditions of the NOFA. Next slide. I mentioned threshold requirements earlier and that there would be some additional detail. And so that is submitting the OHCS DEI agreement, relocation plan and tenant survey, providing the ownership integrity documents, resident services plan, and then the MWESB requirements. Those are all threshold requirements. And yes, the slides will be provided and the webinar is being recorded, and both of those will be posted online. Next slide. In terms of readiness to proceed, we're looking at things: zoning forms, site control, commitment of other resources, evidence of the development schedule, the project site checklist. There's a handful of documents required from the core development manual around design, architectural elements, things of that nature, and then the development team capacity form. We're looking for projects that can start construction within 12 months of a funding reservation. Next slide. So in terms of the competitive scoring for the development resources, it's a total of 100 points, spread pretty evenly: project subsidy levels, readiness, development team capacity. And then we're looking at the resident services that are being proposed and who you're proposing to have them provided by. And then getting some information about the populations that are being proposed for these units. And then lastly, there's 5 points if you can provide evidence that your local COC is in partnership with you and in support of the project. Next slide. So the NOFA says that these resources can fully fund these projects. So debt-free projects are eligible, but with that, we are hoping that folks will be able to leverage additional resources. And the scoring point assignment is here. It's up clearly in the NOFA as well. Project readiness, looking at the development pro forma for 6 points. The operating pro forma is equally weighted for 6 points. And then because we know that housing for these very vulnerable populations is very urgent, readiness to proceed is scored and weighted at 8 points. So wanted to clarify in the development team experience scoring element that these points are stackable, meaning if you have a development team that has completed a project for a qualifying population in the last 10 years, that's 7 points. If they have done that with home, that's another 7 points. And if they have completed an affordable housing project with public funds, but not home, that would be 6 points. And if there's a proposal that comes in because we're hoping to increase rural capacity with this NOFA, applicants who have little or no experience developing affordable housing, but have a clear indication of how they've partnered to get that experience, that's 6 points. Next slide.
Andrea, could I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Gabe Mastis, ODBA. Related to the QPs highlighting veterans and applicants that are serving veterans, are their applications weighted in as much as they are checking off a box for a QP, or is there some type of prioritization or screening that is weighted more heavily as it relates to veterans and serving veterans specifically?
There is no scoring that's specific to veterans at this point.
All right, excellent. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Mariana, you were asking about the rural definition. It is the map that is in the NOFA that was on one of the previous slides. So the green areas in the map are all rural communities. So non-rural communities, other than there's 4 that are called out as being eligible. Yep, not eligible. Okay, so getting back to this, so Kimmy has enough time. Resident services, so the viability of the resident services plan, 12 points. The capacity and experience of the service providers, 8 points. And then in terms of tenant vulnerability, so getting back to the qualifying populations and then the low income populations, the way the NOFA is weighting these points is that if the more qualifying population tenants you have in a project, the more points you will get. So if 100% of the units in the project are qualifying populations, you would get 6 points. And I know it can be a little confusing, but because you don't have to income qualify those tenants, we're putting an additional lens on the second bullet under tenant vulnerability, which is you will need to know the income of your tenants to determine rent. And so we are providing scoring for the lower income percentages associated with the tenants that you're proposing to serve. And then, as I said previously, 4 points for additional affordability. And then lastly, 5 points for a continuum of care organizations support. Next slide. And I think with that, that kind of wraps up the whirlwind overview of the development resources. And I wanted to just see if there were any additional questions at this point. And it is a max of 20 units in the NOFA. Yes, Sarah.
Hi, Andrea. This is
Sorry, can I ask a clarifying question? So the total project or just the home ARP units within, like could the project be 50 units, but only 20 units, or does the entire project have to be 20?
The entire project is 20 units max.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks.
I have 2 clarifying questions. One, is there any tenant assistance, operating assistance provided for this with Home ARP, for this Home ARP program?
Not as part of OHCS's home ARP NOFA, no.
Okay. And then the second question is around the populations. Are there any, can you use this program with any other NOFA funds that you may concurrently have?
Well, in terms of readiness to proceed, we want to see full funding commitments for any other alternative resources that are being leveraged.
Can you have concurrent applications for the same project for separate NOFAs?
You know, we've had some of those internal conversations. I think the answer to that is no, because any other OHCS NOFAs, if that's what you're talking about, we have the same criteria for other funding, leveraged funding commitments. If you're talking about other jurisdictions, you know, I think that's a little difficult to ascertain at this point because it would be determined by the timelines that they have. I mean, at the point where a NOFA application is submitted, projects will be rated on whether or not all of their other funding resources are committed.
Okay. And if you're willing to take the risk that not all the funding sources are committed, because maybe not everybody will have their funds committed.
I mean,
Then
yeah, you can submit an application with not all your funding committed. It may just not be as competitive as another application that does.
okay. All right. And is there a rule in externally that's been published that you can't have 2 applications for 2 different NOFAs?
You're talking about OHCS NOFAs?
Yes.
I think each individual NOFA talks about wanting all of the funding resources reflected on the financial pro forma to be committed.
I think what she's asking, Andrea, is that
Thank you.
you have a project
Uh-huh.
And this project could qualify under two separate types of NOFAs that OHCS has out there. Can she submit them for both sets of NOFAs? Or if she puts it in for the home ARP, is she then not able to put anything in for the 9%, let's say later on?
Yeah, I don't think at this point
Thank you.
OHCS has talked at all about supporting an application for both NOFAs. No.
Yeah, I think we want
Okay.
to see projects fully funded that are coming in for homework.
Well,
think it's
I can appreciate that, but is there a rule that OHCS has that you cannot submit multiple applications for multiple NOFAs? Because the reason I'm asking is because the funding provided at the unit amounts provided do not necessarily make for a whole financing package that I can just take to the bank and or take to fully fund. So the question is, if I have to use two NOFAs, which I don't want to, can I do it? And is there a rule against it? Is it written? And if it's not written, then if it's written, I'd like to see it. If it's not written, then I understand that the commitment issue, yeah, we all want it, all the commitments to be fully funded. That is the preferred option, but this is not 1992.
Mariana, can we look into that and get back to you?
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Kimmy?
Yeah, if there are no other questions right now, of course, you can continue to put questions in the chat, and then we'll be receiving questions through the program email up until I believe the date was September
29th.
29th. Looks like Alex has a question, and then Diana. So Alex, why don't you go ahead and go first?
Okay, thank you. I was just wondering about the affordability period. It looks like beyond the 15 years that OHCS is going to add an additional period for to serve 50% AMI or below. I think that's what the NOFA says. I was just wondering, is that for the entirety of the project or a portion, or kind of what are the parameters of that subsequent 60-year period?
So the NOFA talks about 20 years and additional affordability up to 30. So home ARP resources being put out through this NOFA, OHCS is requiring 20 years of affordability, and there's an additional 4 scoring points for 30 years of affordability.
So does that mean, does that mean that the that you would, that extra 5 years has the exact same conditions on it as what you're getting funded for? So you're gonna, even though the feds are only requiring 15 years, your OHCS is saying it's 20. So the minimum is 20 years under this financing, that whatever you propose in your NOFA.
Yeah. The minimum is 20. I think we just wanted to acknowledge HUD is only requiring 15. OHCS is requiring 20.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, for the entire project.
And then I think Diana was next.
Well, thank you, Kim Ye. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So this is a very simplistic view that I need to get clarification around.
Diana, I can't hear you. I'm hoping it's not my computer.
I think you cut out for me too, Diana. Sorry. Would you be able to type it into the chat, your question, potentially?
Alex, do you
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Oh, I think she might be gone. Alex, did you have another question?
No, I don't.
Okay. All right, Kimmy, I think it's all you.
All right. Well, I feel like my the GHAP CB portion will seem relatively simple compared to the home art portion. Next slide, please. So quick summary, this is 2 million statewide that OHCS is making available from the GHAP capacity building funds. These funds have been available in some form since 2009, but this is the very first time that we are putting them out in this way in support of a development NOFA. So that's really exciting. And it also may mean that when you have specific questions for me that we haven't worked through yet, that I need to kind of make sure that I get clarification on my end before I respond to those. So just a heads up for you on that. It will go out as a grant. The grant payments will be available in full reimbursement or partial advance, and then reimbursement thereafter. Any limitations would include that OHCS seeks to award 2 grants per region for these funds. Next slide. The period of performance, you can request these funds anywhere from 1 to 4 years for the entirety of your project. And then you would just be expected to provide a timeline and activities and budget that align with that. Eligible entities for the GHAP, and this is slightly different than the home ARP, nonprofits, tribal nations, the federally recognized tribes in Oregon, public housing authorities, and local governments are all eligible to be the primary applicant on applications for these funds. Threshold requirement for these, in addition to being an eligible entity, would be your application must demonstrate that you have 3 of these core partnerships in place. And that would be a partnership with an entity that can support housing policy development and facilitate those processes, rental assistance resources, or an organization that can work towards accessing those, and an organization that can provide provision, can provide some key services. I'll get into that a little bit further. Let me pause for 1 second. It looks like something popped up. Diana is asking, this NOFA is for capacity to support homeless and other qualified populations. So a NOFA for development of a physical project is different. If this is true, can both NOFAs be presented as long as thresholds are met? Diana, are you on? Can you clarify for me?
Can you hear me, Kimye?
I can. You know, every time you say that, then you cut out immediately. So let's see how it goes.
I was trying to understand Mariana, and it's in my mind project, but you might be serving the same QP, you know, and so can you submit this NOFA while you're also submitting a NOFA for a physical project for 20 units?
So if you are applying for the home ARP development funds, given the readiness to proceed that we are expecting for those applicants, we are not allowing applicants to apply for both the home ARP development funds and the GHAP capacity building funds at this moment in time.
So it seems like you'd have to have a project in place on the ground to get this money with this NOFA already done, right?
For the home ARP funds?
Or the GHAP.
The GHAP is actually, and we can unpack this a little bit more, and I will absolutely clarify this in a written response in the FAQs. But what we are looking for are applications that have formal or informal commitments from these core partners to work towards capacity building for your location or your region, with the expectation that you would be working towards an eventual application for home ARP funds for development. There's also.
I think
Go
that's
ahead.
enough for now.
Okay, I will, and we can always clarify further in the FAQ or through the chat if needed. Bailey, you had your hand up.
Hi, thanks for allowing me to pose my question. And that is, and I'm wondering if I just kind of connected the dots, so apologies. Is this capacity building grant? It sounds like you said it is to build towards applying for a home art grant. So it wouldn't just be generic, we're building our organization in these ways, but it goes a step further in that you have to be building towards applying towards the home art, which was the first NOFA that we covered.
Yes, so the expectation is that you would be working towards submitting an application for home art funds. Now, we recognize that home art funds may not be available any longer at that point. And so this is an expectation. I do think, and Andrea, if you could jump in, I believe there was a conversation around reserving some home ARP funds for GHAP capacity building applicants who were ready to submit within under 2 years.
Yes, so the NOFA language states that if an entity is awarded GHAP capacity building within 24 months, they do not have to compete for any unallocated home ARP development dollars. They can simply submit a completed NOFA application.
I'm not following, sorry.
So we may or we may not have any GHAP or any home ARP development dollars left. If the NOFA is undersubscribed and then there are unallocated development dollars available, if an entity has requested the GHAP capacity building resources, they can submit an application for development resources within 24 months and not have to compete through a NOFA.
So our hope is that even if the home ARP development funds are no longer available by the time you finish your capacity building work, that you will have advanced the capacity of your organization or the region to apply for other funds or other projects that serve a similar or the same population as the qualifying populations for home ARP.
So just to clarify, just from my role within housing in Oregon, if I am associated within Clackamas County, then should I just assume that none of these are applicable to me?
Clackamas County, that's correct.
Okay, so and then that wouldn't allow us to to submit an application in case there is unallocated funds in the future. We would just have to apply for another NOFA, hoping that development or capacity funds is more generic to come.
I'm sorry, can you restate that? And then I think if it's okay with everyone, we'll ask you to put your questions in the chat, and we will do our best to respond to them in a clear way through the FAQs.
So I guess I'm just asking, if we are looking for capacity building funds, this is not the NOFA that we would want to apply for, because it's to set you up for the home ARP funds.
Correct. I think
Okay.
that both your geographic location, as far as I understand, and also the intent to apply for home ARP funds are kind of limiting factors for this GHAP capacity building offering. We are still working very hard on getting a general capacity building grant out.
Okay.
But a NOFA within our agency, for us to put the GHAP capacity building funds out through a NOFA, it has to be directly tied to a specific development program.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure. Okay, I'm gonna whisk through everything on these slides is also in the NOFA, so don't worry. Let's see. Next slide, please. The purpose is to strengthen the capacity of rural communities and sponsor organizations to develop and operate service-enriched housing for people experiencing or at risk of homelessness, veterans, and domestic violence survivors. Next slide. The main goals of this GHAP capacity building grant that is attached to home ARP is to build the capacity of the sponsors, the local community, or the region to develop and sustain service-enriched affordable rental housing. It's to coordinate and convene local stakeholders and support the ability of a local sponsor to develop a project application for development funding within 2 years. Again, they're the eligible entities that we discussed before. Next slide. Allowable costs include support for regional coordination or work group or body, training, technical assistance, staffing, or other reasonably necessary expenses to build capacity towards the grant's goals. Some pre-development soft costs specific to the project that you're working towards, and any efforts to establish necessary resources and key services. The applications must meet the threshold requirements at the time of application to be considered. Next slide. Pretty standard application review and scoring components here, passing the administrative review, meeting the threshold, and would have the highest ranking score from the scoring committee. Next slide. So there are the following categories the applications will be scored under. The rubric and kind of matrix for that is included in the NOFA. Next slide. But a kind of summary of each area. Under the component 1, there'll be a series of questions around proposed use of funds, and your responses in this section should reflect a cohesive plan for capacity building and convey your knowledge and understanding of the capacity building needs and opportunities, both in your organization and in the local community. Next. We're also looking at the impact to the communities you intend to serve through this future project. We're looking to see that you understand the strengths and challenges to development that exist in the local community and have a preliminary plan for maintaining capacity beyond the life of the grant. Next. So third component would be the impact to the applicant and key partners. We're looking to see that you understand, have a knowledge and understanding of how the strategies you're planning to implement will impact the capacity of the key partners and the primary applicant, and a plan for evaluating these as well. And then we're looking at the approach and readiness that you're planning. So your responses should reflect a clear plan and a feasible approach to managing these activities. And under that, you'll have a timeline, grant activities, partnerships that are in place or those that you intend to put in place during the course of the grant, activities and a budget for doing so. We're looking for a readiness to initiate your capacity building plan. And so it's not necessarily that everything's going to start on day one, but you know, the planning work is part of capacity building. So kind of keep that in mind as you put those together. Next slide. There are priority points involved, and those are detailed also in the rubric and matrix within the NOFA. Some of, actually all of them are listed here, and these are all things that will boost the points, the overall total points, if you have any of these things in place. And we would be asking for you to provide some supporting documentation of having these things in place. Next. So your completed pre-application is a required piece, completed full application with all the questions answered, your timeline, your budget, any supporting documentation that we've asked for, and then any MOUs or letters of support that have been requested under that section for supporting documentation. Next slide. Both applications for the home ARP and also for the GHAP will have a checklist included to help support you in completing the application process, and the Procorm training resources are linked there, as well as you can always reach out to the program email, MFNOFA, with any follow-up questions. And we will be regularly updating and posting the FAQs as we go along. We're a minute over. What's the next slide? Just a reminder of the dates. And I think we had maybe a couple of questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to your other questions right now, but we will make sure that they get answered in the FAQs. Next slide. Oh. Since we're at time, I'll hand it back over to you, Andrea, and thank you so much for carving out some time to talk with us about the NOFA. We're really excited about this. I am.
Thanks, Kimmy. Thank you everyone for joining us. The slide deck, the webinar recording will be posted on the NOFA webpage here shortly this afternoon, if not tomorrow morning. Feel free to email that MFNOFA email address. We will be responsive. We know people still have lots of questions, and we really appreciate your time today. So thank you.